Hi everybody, this is Katje, and this evening I welcome you to my video channel. As you can see, I'm in a kind of a witchy mood again this evening. So I'm wearing a mostly black outfit with my black thigh-length boots and my black short shorts and this skin-tight black top. So I want to, in honor of Halloween that is rapidly approaching, tonight I wanted to tell a kind of a spooky or witchy story. And my story is inspired by two things. One is the 1978 film directed by John Carpenter, Halloween. And as you know, this is the film about Mike Myers, who's a serial killer who comes back to terrorize the town where he grew up. But I don't want to focus so much on the blood and the gore. I'm more interested in the mood created by some of the shots in this film. I have in mind the long shots of this suburban neighborhood. There's this kind of suburban emptiness that comes to take on a kind of ominous, foreboding tone. So John Carpenter does a really good job with creating this mood of kind of eerie mood with these long angle shots. That's one inspiration. And the other inspiration for my story tonight is the 1960s television series The Twilight Zone, produced by Rod Serling, that many of you probably know. What I'm taking from The Twilight Zone, and some of the best episodes of that, is where there's a surprise. There's an unexpected reversal or inversion that gives a kind of eerie result. So I want to put those two things together tonight and tell the story, which is original with me. So instead of calling my story Hansel and Gretel, or I want to turn it around and say Gretel and Hansel, but let's make it more contemporary, and so let's call the name of my story, the title of my story, is Gretchen and Harold. So once upon a time, there was a young girl who was about 10 or 11 years old, who lived with her mother in a suburban neighborhood, fairly quiet suburban neighborhood. And the young girl's name again was Gretchen. She really loved Halloween, but she had noticed over the past few years that Halloween had become much less interesting. In the past, maybe 4 or 5 years ago when she was much younger, but she still remembered it, there were a lot more trick-or-treaters that would come around to the house and knock on the door asking for candy. And in the years since then, they dwindled. There were fewer and fewer of these trick-or-treaters. And so at night, when the Halloween night came, when, let's say, Gretchen turned 12, and she had bought all the candy in the expectation, in the hope that maybe this year some people would show up at the door. And she carved a jack-o'-lantern, and her mother helped her with that. And she put a candle in it and waited for the trick-or-treaters to show up. But nobody came. So it was around 7 o'clock, I guess, when she started to wait. And then it was 8 o'clock, and pretty soon it was full dark, and still nobody had come. And in the meantime, Gretchen could hear her mother at work in the kitchen. She was taking out some pots and pans and filling them with water. She was going to cook a meal that evening. So while Gretchen was waiting for somebody to show up as a trick-or-treater, she would every now and then go back into the house, just open the front door and talk to her mother. And each time she would say, "Well, Mother, nobody is coming. Nobody's here yet." So some more time went by. And at around, say, 9:30 or so, Gretchen could hear these voices somewhere far off in the darkness, somewhere down the street. And she hoped, well, maybe now these trick-or-treaters will show up, and they can come in, and we can give them some candy, and they can meet my mother. And so she was very excited, but nobody came. The voices slowly faded away, and once again it was very quiet in the street. And the jack-o'-lantern had burned down a little bit more. So she opened the door and called to her mother and said, well, I thought some people were coming, but they haven't arrived yet. They never came. And so I guess they decided not to trick or treat. So this happened several times. And each time Gretchen would hear what she thought were the voices of children that were on their way up the street to come trick-or-treating at her house. And even once or twice, she saw what she thought were the bobbing of their flashlights, but nobody ever showed up. Eventually the voices would dwindle and the bobbing lights would disappear, and so it would be very quiet once again in this very wide, empty street that was now totally dark except for a very dim street light down at the corner. And so again, Gretchen told her mother that she thought people were coming, but nobody had. And the mother continued to prepare the meal. She was getting ready to prepare the meal, and she had turned on the stove and was now boiling the water for the evening meal. Now, it was almost 10 o'clock, maybe 10:30, when Gretchen heard another voice, and this time it was very close. And it sounded like the voice of a boy who was kind of talking to himself. Maybe he was a little bit afraid of the dark, and he was talking to himself to reassure himself. And so, sure enough, a few minutes later, this young boy, who must have been about 8 or 9, came into view, and he was wearing a costume. Maybe he had a sheet with holes in it for eyes, so he was a ghost, and he had his trick-or-treat bag, and he was coming up the street. And so he saw the house where Gretchen was, and he sort of made his way in that direction. And Gretchen met him right before the door and said, well, I'm so glad. I assume you've come to trick-or-treat. And I've been waiting for somebody to come trick-or-treating. Nobody has showed up. It's been so many years since anybody's ever come to this house to trick-or-treat. And for whatever reason, they don't come anymore. Halloween is not what it used to be. So the young boy's name was Harold, he told her. And Harold said he didn't want to trick-or-treat, and he wondered if he could have some candy. And so Gretchen said, well, I want you to come inside, and my mother has the candy inside, and she's even making something for dinner, and maybe you would like to have a little something to eat as well. So Harold because this was like his second or first time trick-or-treating, he hadn't really done it, or maybe he hadn't done it in this town. He said, okay, yeah, I'll come in, and maybe I'll get some candy, and maybe get a little something to eat. So he went into the house, and Gretchen took Harold by the hand and led him back to the kitchen, and lo and behold, when they entered the kitchen, it turned out that the mother was a witch. She was an old, ancient crone of a witch with green skin and black lips and large, black, bulging eyes. And what she was actually doing was she had a big pot on the stove with water in it, and she was hoping that if somebody came to trick-or-treat, she would take the child and throw the child into the pot and cook it. And Gretchen was going to help her with that. And sure enough, that's what they did. So the reason that the streets around the house were so empty, and the reason that nobody had come trick-or-treating there for many, many years, is that the rest of the town knew, or at least suspected, that Gretchen's mother was a wicked witch, and that Gretchen would help her when she could to snare unsuspecting children so that the witch could then boil them and eat them with her daughter. So that's the story that I wanted to tell in honor of Halloween. And also I wanted to have a chance to model my witchy outfit. So again, the name of the story is Harold and Gretchen, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I look forward to talking to you next time. I hope that everybody will have an enjoyable evening, and that everybody will have a wonderful Halloween when it finally comes. So this is Katje, Good Witch Katje, saying good night once again, and wishing everybody a very restful and peaceful night. Bye-bye.